On a freezing December night in 1944, while General George S. Patton surveyed the front lines with his signature ivory-handled revolvers, a quiet intelligence officer named Colonel Oscar Koch stared at a map that whispered of impending doom. While the world celebrated an early victory, these two men prepared for a nightmare that Allied Supreme Command insisted was mathematically impossible. This is the story of the greatest intelligence catch in history. In the final months of 1944, the atmosphere across the European theater of operations crackled with a dangerous and intoxicating sense of impending triumph as Allied forces surged toward the German border. While in the newly liberated streets of Paris, American soldiers crowded into bustling cafes to clink glasses of champagne and flirt with local girls under the dim glow of cheap tinsel and makeshift Christmas lights. The consensus among the highest echelons of military leadership in Washington and at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was that Adolf Hitler had finally reached the end of his rope. They believed the Nazi war machine was collapsing under its own immense weight, its armies out of fuel, its air force grounded, and its commanders merely waiting for the inevitable signal to surrender. This widespread optimism created a lethal blind spot that stretched across the rugged and heavily forested region known as the Ardennes, a sector so quiet that American commanders referred to it as a nursery, where exhausted divisions went to rest and green troops went to learn the ropes. While the politicians and high-ranking generals savored their perceived triumph, Colonel Oscar Koch sat alone in a dimly lit room in eastern France, staring at a wall-sized map that refused to join the celebration. As the chief of intelligence for General George S. Patton's Third Army, Koch was a man who preferred the cold logic of data over the warm comfort of propaganda. He was a quiet figure with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers, a stark contrast to the loud and theatrical Patton, yet he was the indispensable mind behind the muscle of the Third Army's legendary armored columns. Each day, Koch stood before his massive situation map, meticulously marking the locations of every known German unit with grease pencil lines and colored pins that crisscrossed the continent. He tracked these enemy divisions like a seasoned hunter tracking a wounded predator, noting every subtle shift in position, every suspicious gap in the line, and every emerging pattern of movement. In late October of 1944, the patterns that had defined the German retreat suddenly and inexplicably broke as the most dangerous armored formations began to evaporate from their reconnaissance reports. The 6th Panzer Army disappeared from the maps, followed shortly by the 5th Panzer Army, leaving Koch to wonder where these elite forces had gone. These were not battered remnants of a defeated army, but hardened SS Panzer divisions equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks that had spent years honing their lethality on the Eastern Front. At Supreme Headquarters, the big-picture analysts simply shrugged off these disappearances, suggesting that radio silence from those sectors was merely proof of German weakness and a sign that the enemy was finally breaking. They argued that the Germans were likely pulling back to conserve fuel and digging in for a last-ditch defense behind the Rhine River. But Koch saw the same silence and reached a much more chilling conclusion. He understood that massive armies do not simply dissolve into thin air, and that if the most lethal armored corps in Europe had vanished, it meant that they were hiding in preparation for a massive strike. Koch began to ignore the upbeat summaries from London and instead dove into the granular details that others skimmed past, such as obscure railway reports and scattered reconnaissance photos. His investigation revealed a series of anomalies that pointed toward a massive German buildup under the cover of darkness as heavy freight trains were spotted heading west toward the front lines. Koch questioned why a supposedly retreating army would send vital equipment and fuel toward the front instead of pulling it back toward the safety of the German heartland. He then noticed another disturbing pattern as field agents reported that German civilians living near the quiet Ardennes forest were being systematically evacuated from their villages. Entire towns were being emptied, and roads were being cleared of civilian traffic, a logistical move that only made sense if those roads were being reserved for something massive and violent. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of meteorological reports warning of a massive storm system rolling in from the Atlantic, a front that would bring heavy snow and dense fog. While most commanders viewed the weather as a mere inconvenience that would ground their planes, Koch recognized it as the perfect cover for an enemy that lacked air superiority. Bad weather meant blind skies, and blind skies meant the Germans could concentrate their armor without the fear of being annihilated by Allied fighter bombers. Koch realized that the Germans were not preparing for a defense, but were instead using the Ardennes as the stage for one last brutal gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the crucial port of Antwerp. Separate from one another, these facts were perhaps meaningless, but when Koch put the pieces together, they spelled a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions for the Allied cause. The Ardennes was no longer a sleepy backwater, but a loaded gun pointed directly at the heart of the American positions. And Koch knew he had to convince someone with the power to act. In early December, he raised his concerns at Allied headquarters, but was met with smirks and dismissive comments from other intelligence staff who labeled him a worrier and a pessimist. They pointed to the wrecked German factories and shattered Luftwaffe squadrons as proof that a major offensive was mathematically impossible. Yet Koch refused to back down from his analysis. Instead of shouting or pounding the table, Koch returned to the giant map he maintained for General Patton and drew a bold red question mark over the Ardennes sector, accompanied by the words, "enemy concentration." To some of the visiting staff officers, this scribble looked absurd and alarmist, but to Koch, it was the only honest reflection of the tactical reality facing the Third Army. He was effectively the boy in the crowd, pointing out that the Emperor had no clothes. Only this time, the wolf gathering in the woods carried 88mm guns and was driven by a desperate ideology. By December 9th, the indicators were no longer just troubling. They were screaming as more rail shipments and more evacuations were reported across the sector. Koch saw the window of opportunity closing and understood that if Patton's Third Army continued its drive eastward, without adjusting its flank, it would be caught completely off guard by a German blow. A sudden attack from the Ardennes could slice the Allied line in two and isolate entire armies, turning the march to victory into a slaughter of unimaginable scale. Koch made the brave decision to go straight to the one man who might actually listen, even though entering George Patton's office was often a terrifying experience for any staff officer. Patton was famous for his explosive temper and his absolute intolerance for anything he perceived as cowardice or defeatism, and he lived for aggressive forward motion. Coming to Patton with a warning to slow down and prepare for a defensive battle was like walking into a lion's den with bad news. Yet Koch walked in carrying his detailed maps and his meticulously kept notes. He spread the documents out across Patton's desk, and the room fell into a heavy silence as the quiet colonel began to explain the missing armored divisions. Koch pointed to the rail lines running at night, the empty towns, the weather reports, and the glaring gap in the Allied line where green and exhausted units sat in thin positions. He argued calmly and logically that the German capability for a counteroffensive existed, and that the Ardennes was the only place where such a blow would make strategic sense. For a long moment, the staff officers in the room held their breath, expecting Patton to lash out and ridicule the warnings as he usually did with negative intelligence. Instead, the general walked to the window and stared out at the gray winter sky, contemplating the risk of ignoring the advice of a man he had trusted for years. Patton knew that Koch did not trade in guesses or rumors, and that if the colonel was willing to put his reputation on the line, the danger must be very real. Patton turned back to the map, studied the red question mark, and muttered that it was indeed the perfect place for an enemy to try and cut the front in half. In a rare display of humility, Patton set his massive ego aside and abandoned his cherished plan of continuing the drive into the heart of Germany. Instead of insisting on his own vision of the battlefield, he looked at Koch and asked a single, simple question. What do we do? Koch did not hesitate because he had already thought through the contingency, suggesting that the Third Army needed a secret plan to pivot its entire force 90 degrees. This maneuver would require reorienting 250,000 men and thousands of tanks in the dead of winter, a logistical feat that many considered to be a miracle. Patton did not flinch at the scale of the challenge and ordered his staff to start the secret planning immediately, keeping the details away from Eisenhower and the Supreme Command for the time being. For the next week, the Third Army lived a double life, appearing to prepare for an invasion of Germany on paper, while secretly scouting new routes and testing bridges for tank weight. They moved fuel dumps under cover and identified staging areas for a northbound dash that no one else in the Allied leadership believed would ever be necessary. Koch and the staff worked through the night, tracing narrow country roads and calculating the movement of armored columns through the coming snow. While this ghost army was being prepared in the south, the unwitting victims of the coming storm sat in their foxholes 60 miles to the north, shivering in the damp cold of the Ardennes. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, many of whom were barely out of basic training, complained about their thin winter gear and wrote letters home about Christmas presents. They could not see the white-clad German infantry slipping into position among the dark pines, nor could they hear the low growl of the Tiger tanks waiting just beyond the ridges. On the night of December 15, Koch sat alone with his map, knowing that the trap was set and that the time for interpretation had finally come to an end. At 5:30 in the morning, on December 16, 1944, the silence of the forest was ripped open by the roar of 1,600 German artillery pieces, firing at the same instant. The night sky turned into a wall of orange fire as shells screamed over the treetops, and the earth shuddered with such force that men were thrown from their foxholes. This was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, a massive German counteroffensive that would test the resolve of the Allied armies and the foresight of the two men who had dared to see the truth. The world outside the Ardennes was still asleep, but for the American soldiers caught in the initial shock of the German onslaught, the nightmare was just beginning. The massive artillery barrage was followed by the eerie, metallic clatter of hundreds of panzer tracks grinding through the snow as the 6th Panzer Army lunged forward into the thin Allied lines. Communication wires were severed instantly by the shelling, and a thick, unnatural fog swallowed the battlefield, rendering the American superior air power completely useless, while German infantry in white camouflage suits emerged like ghosts from the tree line. Confusion reigned at the highest levels of the Allied command, as reports of small-scale raids were mistaken for minor local skirmishes. But on the ground, the reality was a tidal wave of steel that threatened to wash away months of progress. German commandos, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, had infiltrated behind the lines wearing American uniforms and driving captured jeeps, flipping road signs and cutting telephone lines to sow maximum chaos among the retreating units. As the great snafu gripped the front, the only thing standing between the German panzers and the open roads to the Meuse River were isolated pockets of American soldiers who refused to run, fighting desperate holding actions in frozen villages whose names they could barely pronounce. By December 18th, the sheer scale of the catastrophe finally pierced the bubble of optimism at Supreme Headquarters, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower called for an emergency meeting in a cold, damp barracks at Verdun. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of wet wool as the top commanders of the Western Front gathered around a single map that showed a massive, growing bulge in their lines. Eisenhower looked at his generals and stated flatly that the current situation was to be viewed as an opportunity rather than a disaster. Yet the faces around the table remained grim and uncertain. He knew he needed a miracle, and he turned his gaze toward the one man who had been preparing for this very moment for weeks. General George S. Patton sat at the table, his face a mask of iron determination, having already received the frantic updates from Colonel Koch back at 3rd Army Headquarters. When Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to disengage his army from their current offensive in the south and pivot 90 degrees to attack the German flank, the room went silent. Most of the staff officers expected Patton to ask for a week or more to manage such a complex logistical nightmare. But Patton simply leaned forward and said he could start with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The claim was so audacious that it drew gasps of disbelief from the other generals, with some even whispering that Patton's ego had finally overridden his military judgment. What they did not know was that because of Colonel Koch's warnings, Patton had already begun the process of moving his heavy equipment and identifying the routes days before the first German shell was even fired. As soon as the meeting ended, Patton bypassed the usual chain of command and began barking orders into a field telephone, initiating the greatest movement of men and material in the history of modern warfare. Over the next 3 days, more than 250,000 men and 130,000 vehicles began a frantic, synchronized dash northward through a landscape of ice and fire. Truck drivers pushed their engines to the breaking point, driving through the night with dimmed headlights on roads that were nothing more than ribbons of black ice winding through steep mountain passes. This was not a structured march, but a desperate race against time, as engineers worked frantically to reinforce bridges that were never designed to hold the weight of 60-ton Sherman tanks. Every minute mattered because 40 miles to the north, the vital crossroads town of Bastogne was being surrounded by 7 German divisions, and if the town fell, the road to the sea would be wide open for Hitler's panzers. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne Division were digging into the frozen earth with their bayonets because the ground was too hard for shovels. They were short on food, low on ammunition, and lacked winter clothing. Yet they held their positions in the woods around the town as the German ring tightened. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, and the constant sound of German screaming Mimi rockets echoed through the shattered remains of the town's buildings. On December 22nd, 2 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag of truce, carrying a formal demand for the immediate surrender of the garrison to avoid total annihilation. When the message reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, he looked at the paper with a mixture of exhaustion and irritation, and his initial response was a single, 4-letter word that has since become a legend in military history. He told his staff he didn't know what to say, and an officer suggested that his first reaction was the best one, leading to the official typed response. To the German commander, "Nuts!" The American commander. This defiant reply was delivered back to the bewildered Germans, and while it boosted the morale of the freezing paratroopers, it also signaled the start of an even more brutal phase of the siege as the Germans unleashed every gun they had to flatten the town. While Bastogne held on by a thread, Patton's Third Army was battling not just the Germans, but the very elements themselves, as a relentless blizzard grounded the Allied Air Force and buried the roads in deep drifts of snow. Frustrated by the weather that was protecting the German columns, Patton famously ordered his chaplain to write a prayer asking for clear skies so that his planes could see the targets. It was a moment of supreme confidence and characteristic Patton flair, as he demanded the Almighty join the Allied cause to help him crush the Hun once and for all. Whether by divine intervention or a shift in the high-pressure system, the clouds suddenly parted on December 23rd, revealing a brilliant, cold blue sky that allowed thousands of Allied fighter bombers to swarm over the German supply lines. The Panzers, which had been moving with impunity under the fog, were suddenly caught in the open and turned into blazing pyres of steel by P-47 Thunderbolts. This was the opening Patton needed, and he ordered the 4th Armored Division to punch a hole through the German lines at any cost, leading the charge with a ferocity that stunned the overstretched German defenders. The fighting along the road to Bastogne was a series of brutal, small-unit actions, where tanks fought at point-blank range in the blinding snow, and infantry cleared foxholes with grenades and bayonets. On the afternoon of December 26th, a column of tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spotted the silhouettes of the 101st Airborne's positions. They didn't wait for orders, but instead crashed through the final German line, the lead Sherman tank, nicknamed Cobra King, rolling into the American perimeter to the cheers of the weary paratroopers. The relief of Bastogne was the psychological turning point of the entire battle, signaling to the German high command that their gamble had failed to achieve its primary objective. While the fighting would continue for another month as the Bulge was slowly pushed back to the original border, the strategic initiative had shifted irrevocably back to the Allies. Hitler's last great reserve of tanks and elite infantry had been spent in the snows of the Ardennes, leaving the defense of the German heartland to old men and boys as the Red Army prepared its final assault from the east. The cost of the victory was staggering, with the Battle of the Bulge becoming the bloodiest conflict American forces had ever faced, resulting in nearly 80,000 casualties. The landscape was littered with the charred remains of thousands of vehicles and the frozen bodies of young men who would never see the end of the war they had almost finished. For the Germans, the losses were even more catastrophic, as they had lost over 100,000 men and nearly all of the armored strength they needed to protect Berlin. Colonel Oscar Koch, the man who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was looking at the sunshine, remained in the shadows as the medals were handed out to the more famous generals. He did not seek the spotlight, satisfied in the knowledge that his meticulous maps and his refusal to accept easy answers had saved thousands of lives. Patton, however, never forgot the man who had given him the gift of time, frequently citing Koch's intelligence work as the foundation upon which the Third Army's legendary reputation was built. The Battle of the Bulge serves as a timeless reminder of the danger of organizational arrogance and the vital importance of the quiet voices in leadership. It proves that a single intelligence officer with the courage to challenge the consensus can change the course of a world war, provided they have a leader willing to listen. As the sun set over the liberated forests of the Ardennes in January of 1945, the road to Berlin was finally clear, and the shadow of the swastika began to fade from the map of Europe forever. If you were in General Eisenhower's shoes at the Verdun Conference, would you have trusted Patton's claim to move his entire army in 48 hours? Or would you have played it safe and waited for reinforcements? Let us know your strategy in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.